18 months had passed since the end of Red Dwarf Series 5. Back to Reality was one of the best episodes in Red Dwarf's history, and none of the episodes takes place on board Red Dwarf proper. Starbike had been a central base for several of the episodes in Series 5. Red Dwarf had been appearing less and less prominently, in some episodes only appearing briefly either at the very end, or the very beginning, or both. There are exceptions to this, but generally Red Dwarf had a diminished presence in Series 5, more so than any previous series. Holly, who had been a main character since the series started in 1988, had also been seen less and less on screen in Series 5 than in previous series. During the first two series, when Holly was played by Norman Lovett, Holly was a fairly prominent character. This continued into Series 3, when Holly was now played by Hattie Hayridge. Series 4 started to show a slight reduction in screen time for the character. Crichton now served as the exposition character. Series 5 is when Holly is noticeably absent from large chunks of the series. The writers found it harder and harder to write for the character. So the writers Doug Naylor and Rob Grant decided to write out these two elements of the show. In doing this, it shook up the series format, which was potentially at risk of becoming stale. Going into Red Dwarf 6 series, things were very different. The opening first few minutes of Lister acclimatizing after being in suspended animation for 200 years are really great. The humour works really well. Crichton appears to have been given funnier lines to say than previously. Perhaps this isn't really the case. But anyway, Robert Llewellyn is just fantastic as Crichton. Craig Charles is brilliant as Lister, who does not know his identity for much of the first few minutes, so his performance is played very differently from normal. The visual effects in this episode have aged really well. The model shots of Starbike flying through space in particular look fantastic, as do the shots of Rimmer's hologram being reactivated. That scene, while we're on the subject, includes some brilliant visual jokes. The rate of cracking jokes has certainly increased in this series, and in a show like Red Dwarf, that is most certainly a good thing. It soon becomes apparent that the crew have lost Red Dwarf and have spent the last 200 years following it. The set design for Starbike is great, and as Starbike is the main location for the episodes now, more detail was required for the sets. The design is great, it feels cramped and a tad claustrophobic, which is a brilliant contrast from the wide and gigantic Red Dwarf. The battered and bruised look of Starbike is great also. You really get the sense that this ship isn't exactly brand spanking new. The general idea surrounding the Psirens is fairly good. It allowed for some great jokes, all centering around each character's unique quirks and traits. The big issue with the Psirens is just a simple lack of screen time. It takes around 9 minutes before we see the Psirens. A sizable chunk of the episode has already been lost to setting up the main series arc and joke cracking. However, the resolution with the two Listers is fantastic. We've seen multiple versions of the Dwarfers before, but here there is that added dose of humour. Again, from the first episode, it is clear that Series 6 is going to be far funnier and wittier than previous series. Lister being a dreadful guitar player is once again brought up here, with the Siren copy playing the guitar perfectly, thereby making itself easily identifiable. Lister being a dreadful guitar player has been brought up several times before, mainly as an excuse for a quick gag before moving the plot along, but here things are far more memorable and the writing comes across as far better. Psirens had quite a lot to juggle. It had a new format and premise to introduce whilst keeping things humorous and entertaining. It will come as no surprise to some that Psirens is not exactly a beloved and popular episode of Red Dwarf, unlike the one that came right before it. However, it is still hugely entertaining. The absences of Red Dwarf and Holly are acknowledged, but the episode doesn't feel lacking because these two aspects are no longer in the show. In fact, the show seems somewhat liberated by this change. Psirens is a somewhat decent opener to Series 6. It isn't quite as original and memorable as previous series openers such as Backwards, but it is far funnier than the likes of Hollow Ship. Psirens, unlike previous series openers, actually sets up a series arc, which helps to keep the audience hooked. The next episode is Legion.